live in one of the northern states where temperatures start dropping fast in the fall. Because of this, and since we had a fireplace, we typically had it on instead of the heat. As an adult now, I've learned how much it can really save on heating bills. My parents would usually buy logs in bulk, but we did have a lot of acreage, so just to pad the supply, my dad would also cut down some trees or branches around the property. Of course, being around 14 or 15, I would help my dad collect it and bring it back. I never had a problem with it though. I enjoyed the fall and winter as well as the time I got to spend alone with my dad. We usually just pushed the wheelbarrow around or a small trailer attached to an ATV to lug them back to the house, depending on the weather. Another normal occurrence when we were out there was the wildlife. We would see birds, rabbits, squirrels, and even deers. We pretty much coexisted with them all. It may come as a surprise to some, but my family was not a bunch of hunters. They didn't like the idea of killing them, in fact. My dad hated the hunting seasons because we could hear the gunshots all over. He didn't even own a gun. They were both weirdo, hippie country folk, but I can appreciate that. Even as an adult, hunting does not interest me. Anyways, so when we're out, sometimes we would name off birds that we saw or other animals, and based on what they were doing or how they looked, we made stories about them. We would even give them a name, a backstory, and even where they were heading. But when we did come across coyotes, foxes, and even one terrifying time a mountain lion, we stayed back and avoid them as much as possible. Besides, we're the ones that are more out of place than them. Sorry for rambling, just wanted to share a bit of backstory of my family and to possibly explain why we reacted the way we did to the following event. So one fall day, I had helped my dad cut down a tree that was in the way of some fencing he was putting up. We had to stop to go get a part for the wheelbarrow because one of the legs had broken or something in the middle of me bringing it over. As one simple task normally does, it ended up taking us all day to finish it. I don't remember exactly what all happened, but it was probably the normal multiple trips and errands to run, and then by the time we got home and fixed the damn thing, my mom had dinner started and said I needed to do my homework before anything else. So we decided to wait until after I finished and we had dinner before we went back out there. I think we were both feeling pretty worn out, and since it was getting late, my dad suggested we just take the ATV instead to make the trip easier. So we got back to the tree and started loading up the trailer with the smaller stuff. While doing so, I started feeling like I was being watched. As mentioned, it was normal to see animals and have some of them just stare, but this feeling was putting me on edge. I started looking around everywhere when I spotted something between the trees on the other side of the house. At first, it had the shape of a dog, so I thought it was either a stray or maybe a coyote, but the more I looked at it, the more uneasy I felt. My dad must have noticed me stop, and he asked what I was looking at, so I pointed it out to him. He stopped as well and stared at the thing. I remember asking him what he thought it was, and after hesitating for several moments, he finally said, "It looks like a rough-looking dog." I could tell in his voice, though, that he didn't like this either. Usually when we ran into potentially dangerous animals, my dad was calm and just suggested we move on. However, he would not look away from this thing. I asked him if he was feeling creeped out too, and surprisingly, he said yeah. So I started telling him how I was feeling too. That's when he told me that something just wasn't right about the creature. We just stood there, completely still, and watched this thing until it finally moved. It started walking along the trees, but the way it was walking was even more unnatural. It had 4 legs, but it wasn't bending them at the knees. The movement was very stiff. Imagine how a doll would walk without the knee joints, or when you walk your fingers like legs. Sorry if this doesn't make sense, but it's kind of hard to explain. So when I saw it walking, I became even more alarmed. I mentioned it to my dad, but he just continued watching it. The thing started walking towards us, which meant the trees were thinning out, shedding more light on it. That's when we could see more details. This thing was definitely bigger than a coyote, but it looked disheveled. Its fur was dirty and almost patchy looking. While it seemed to look dark and have an even darker aura around it, it had bright, glowing orange-looking eyes. As it got closer, we also started smelling something like rotting. Again, we saw a lot of wildlife, some alive and some dead, so I knew the smell. We didn't smell it until we noticed this creature. As it walked closer, we could make out a moaning sound that also didn't sound natural. It didn't sound like a person, but it also didn't sound like an animal in pain. This was when the feeling of dread really started to overwhelm me. But before I could mention it to my dad, without taking his sight off this thing, he told me to run towards the house as fast as I could. When I heard him shout "run," I took off only to look back once to see my dad right behind me. He nearly shoved me in the house as he ran in behind me, closing and locking the door. My mom and 2 little siblings were all watching a movie in the living room, so she was instantly startled and asked us what happened. My dad let out a little laugh, saying we saw a coyote that was looking pretty aggressive, so we decided to run home. She seemed a bit suspicious, but accepted his response and we went to clean up. I wasn't about to call my dad out. I assume he did it since my siblings were there and probably didn't want to scare my mom. He probably would have done the same to me if I hadn't witnessed it. We didn't talk about it again that night, and we went and finished gathering the wood the next day when it was nice and bright out. I asked him about it then, if he really thought it was a coyote, and he honestly told me no. He said he didn't know what it was, but he knew it wasn't a normal animal and that it wasn't friendly. I asked him what he thought it was, and he didn't answer me for a while. Then he finally spoke up, and the only thing he said was, "It's something we should never think about or talk about again." My dad was not easily frightened, but the tone in this response was enough to make me think he was serious, so I never brought it up again. Now that I'm older and after seeing many stories of cryptids and talking to friends that believe in that kind of stuff, I'm pretty sure it was a skinwalker. Regardless, it was a terrifying sight, and those out there trying to find one to witness themselves, I would suggest stopping now. It's really not worth it.